Welcome to Ship Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and we are here for the 15th in about a 34-part series as we journey chapter by chapter through Fairy Tale by Stephen King. Hey, if you want to help me out on the channel, it really does the trick if you decide to hit that like button at some point in time. And if you want a comment addressed in a future video in this series, be sure to drop one in the comment section below. But of course, we are starting with those comments, after which we will have a So What Happened portion of the video where we go over what happened in the chapter, followed by a lit crit portion of the video, and finally a writer's circle portion of the video. But beginning with the comments, Mike brought back up Vonnegut's 8 rules of writing. He said he had to look them up, and I want to talk about my favorite of those 8 rules of writing, which is number 4. Number 4 is really a rule of writing that encapsulates how difficult it is or should be to be a writer. Every sentence must do one of 2 things: reveal character or advance the action. Now, it sounds simple. Reveal character or advance the action. Now, what type of sentence are you going to put out there that does neither of those things? But it's possible to put sentences out there that do neither of those things in any actual portion. Writing a sentence that reveals character is not the same thing as writing a sentence that happens, and is not the same thing as writing a sentence from the character. Here we have a first-person story, but it is not necessary that every sentence that comes to us from Charlie actually reveals his character. There are some things which are so bland, so obvious as to not reveal character, and there are some things that are so mundane as to not advance the action. There is a fine balance to be had in making sure that every sentence you put on paper does one of those 2 things. This is another one of those things that when you look at a writer like Hemingway, probably pulled that off. But he probably pulled that off in a very different way than a writer like Vonnegut probably pulled that off. Vonnegut was much more character-oriented. Vonnegut's characters are much quirkier than are... In fact, it's almost too perfect that Vonnegut ended up doing illustrations for most of his works, the cover art and things like that, because his writing reads... When you read his stuff, you're not seeing the guy that sat next to you on the train today. You're seeing a character. You're seeing a cartoon, almost. Hemingway, you see that rough guy that passed you on the street and wasn't looking you in the eyes. So when we examine the 2 of these differences, one of the ways that this manifests is in the sentences chosen to advance the character. Hemingway's sentences are very cut and dry, very forward, very real person. Vonnegut's sentences, not as much. Vonnegut's sentences wander a whole lot more, and so you get this sort of out there feeling from all of Vonnegut's work. And that's interesting, isn't it? Especially when this observation is one that comes to us from Vonnegut as opposed to Hemingway. But that is my favorite of his 8 rules of writing. Next, Tanya, who has been a friend of the channel for as long as I can remember, and this channel goes back to 2015, by the way, says, since you pointed it out, I have been noticing the not needed words so much more. King is usually a very long-winded writer, but he really let it out in this one. First off, I'm sorry. I hope I didn't ruin it for you. Second off, yeah, he is normally long-winded, but it does strike differently here. And why is that? If we look back at that 4th rule of creative writing that we get from Vonnegut, every sentence has to do one of 2 things: further the action or explicate character. Now, I know I keep going back to The Shining. I know I keep doing that. There's a lot of explaining in The Shining that probably doesn't, quote-unquote, have to be there. It's not the cleanest. But I would argue that all of the wordiness that pops up in The Shining is wordiness that ends up giving us something about characters. All of the long stories that take us away from what is going on in the novel are things that tell us something about the characters themselves. For example, there is the story of the Martians. Remember that one? Where Jack and I believe it's his boss, who's also his sponsor, get into the car wreck. They hit a bike. They hope. Remember that? That tells us a lot about Jack. It's not necessary to The Shining itself, but that entire story is something which tells us a lot about Jack, where he was, where he's hoping to be, and the dark side of his character. It doesn't further the action at all, but it furthers the character of Jack. Herein, all of the extra wordiness, that we have in Fairy Tale is not necessarily wordiness which explicates character or furthers the action. All of that extra little wordiness, they're just words. The little extra bits of dialogue here and there, it reads like a writer who had himself on a pitch count, right? A writer who's saying, okay, got to sit down, got to get 3,000 words today. And when you're reading back through, you got to like 2,800 words. And man, look, I could stop on the day, but I'm really on this streak where I'm getting these 3,000 every day. And if I keep 3,000 every day, then it's 4 months until I've got this novel written. Let me spruce up this dialogue and add 10 words here. They're not words that really do anything, but they're not necessarily objectionable. That's how all of this reads. It is possible, I think, to be wordy, but fairly clean. To be wordy, but to feel like a polished draft. A lot of the writing here in Fairy Tale does not necessarily, to me, feel that way. And finally, we get a comment from PF, who weighs in saying, start doing 3 chapters per video. Because the claim is that I made the claim, this is absolutely tanking my channel. And it's true. No one's going to watch you're here, and I love you for it. No one's going to watch the 15th in a 32 chapter series. No one at all. Besides you and me. We're here. We're here together. We're here for each other. It's the camaraderie, really. But it does nothing for me on YouTube. In fact, the algorithm works such that this sort of thing is completely detrimental. But I'm willing to make that sacrifice, and here's why. I'm a purist, and I'm a completionist. Except for the things I don't finish. But look, here's the thing. These arguments for literature have to keep being made. They just have to. There has to be people going through books in this fashion in order that the argument keeps being made. When I say the argument for literature, what do I mean? I mean the argument for literature. I mean, there's going to be, we're in possibly devastating times. And a lot of nuance is lost. And I know nuance itself has become cliche. Nuance, bro, right? Debate me with nuance, right? All of these little cliches and sort of memes that pop up around the phrase nuance. But it has to keep being made. It has to. It simply has to. One of the other plans that I have for this channel is to go poem by poem through the entirety of Emily Dickinson. 1,775 poems. Look, there are probably 15-ish poems from Emily Dickinson that will get any play, but that doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is that listen, some people collect things. I'm not really the type to collect things. I don't really care about having stuffs. Collecting arguments of, about, and for literature is important to me. And that's why I'm doing this. Now, so what happened in this chapter, Dora gives Charlie a type of wheelbarrow in case he needs to carry radar as they are on their journey. They're kicking off on their journey. They meet some sad souls along the way. They run into a dwarf torturing a huge red cricket, just torturing it. And Charlie stands up to him, threatens him, and thinks of breaking his wrist. You know, all of the normal stuff that you do when you run across someone like that. Just normal stuff until finally he gets to Leia's uncle's house. Leia's uncle was waiting for Charlie because Leia talked to him telepathically. Also, the uncle is blind because there's always a blind guy in one of these fantasy type stories. Has to be. It's a rule. It is one of the 8 rules of fantasy writing. He, the uncle, was a prince regent before the hard times. The uncle and Leia were the royal family and have been purged by Flight Killer. Their royal blood saves them from the gray, which is the one thing going on, but they each have been robbed of one of their senses. Sending Charlie on his way, the uncle, who we learn is Woody, gives him a golden knocker because that seems the right thing to do. Anytime I hear of a knocker, I think of Young Frankenstein. So what are we doing here? Let's start looking around. Now, instead of starting with the text itself, I want to start with an observation about the text. Zooming out, we have here a whopping 26-page chapter. Now, not all that much work. There's not a whole lot of heavy digging so far in this work. There's not a whole lot of confusing literary type language, any of that sort of thing. But I've been saying it all along. Stephen King hasn't found his story. He's got 16-page chapters. Intro, character moment, dip out. He's got 19-page chapters. Intro, character moment, dip out. These are signs that you were writing by rote. These are signs that you were painting by number. These are signs that you are sort of going through the process. But a 26-page chapter right in the middle of things, it seems we're starting to find the story. Sometimes you have to bring math into analysis, I think. And when you've got a chapter that is, this has got to be 50% bigger than his previous chapters. You've got a writer who is finally saying to himself, okay, I got something, let's roll. As opposed to, how are we going to get out of this chapter? How are we going to make an exit from this place here? You have a writer who has something in mind, wants to express it, and is using, Stephen King has been published, was Carrie 1974? I believe, off the top of my head. So 74 to 84, 84 to 94, 94 to 04, 04 to 24, or to 14, 14 to 24. We're coming up on 50 years of King. 40 years of King? Am I doing this wrong? No, we're coming up on 50 years of King's writing. You have someone who is, I'm not going to say set in his ways, but you definitely have a writer who knows how to get started and had refused to this point to go ahead and get started. Felt like he was putting on the writer's mask. So, moving on, we have a good quote here on 251. So this brings, again, not disparagingly, King is not a particularly quotable writer. King is one who is more of a story writer than a wordsmith. But on 251, we get good people shine brighter in dark times. A bit trite, okay. A bit heavy-handed, but I think it's a pretty good quote. And I think it's something that is translatable onto life. When you think about the darker times in history, brighter light has to shine to illuminate the way. So this is the second good quote, I think, in addition to, what was it a few chapters back? Strong men help, weak men give gifts, or something like that. I can't remember exactly the quote, but I will go back and find it for the review. There is a question that rises for me due to this on 254. We get this from Charlie. The idea that I could get killed going in the direction of the city came as no great surprise to me. Mr. Bowditch, Dora, and Leia had all made that clear in their various ways. But when you're a kid, it's easy to believe that you will be the exception, the one who wins through and gets the laurels. I had not imagined this before. I had not taken this into account. I thought that we were getting a fairly straightforward first-person narrator. I thought that he was a trustworthy narrator, a reliable narrator. Is he a dead narrator? That had not occurred to me, but I think it's possible. This is not beyond the scope of what would be possible in a fantasy-type novel. Moving forward, I want to see how I need to do this. So we had talked about we had talked about this possibly, the core metaphor here being Stephen King as Bowditch, Charlie as his son, Impus as writing itself, creating the gold-giving world that keeps you alive through all time. Again, I believe Carrie was 1974, which would mean 50 years that book has lived. There's been at least one TV series about it, maybe two. There's been, I think, 2 movies made from it. It is a book that continues to be read today, and that's just Carrie. Carrie, probably my second least favorite of the completed King novels that I've read. After Dark Tower, I did not like Dark Tower. Possibly it'll be third after this book, but that is the timelessness that is offered by writing. You go there and you are rejuvenated. You go there to this magical world and you can live forever, and it gives you gold. Stephen King's experience with writing, Mr. Bowditch's experience with Impus, passing on to his son, passing on to Charlie, this world of writing. So we get on page 255, we get this from Charlie, who immediately in the aftermath of deciding realizing, yeah, I could die here, I thought I was becoming part of the story. I thought I was becoming part of the story. What writer does not lose his or herself within the pages of their work? What writer does not end up becoming part of the story? It's easy from the outset to look out and say, yeah, I write these things and they're my stories. You're in there. Whether you like to admit it or not, all that can ever be in there is you and your dirty little mind. Which, that is sort of a cutesy reminder, but it is not necessarily the most corroborative piece of bit that we have here. On 264, he's talking about Mr. Bowditch. Charlie is talking about Mr. Bowditch to Woody. And he says he was partial to fanciful stories. Oh, no. This is Woody, maybe. Yeah, this is Woody talking about Mr. Bowditch to Charlie. He was partial to fanciful stories, like the one I was reading while I waited for your arrival. dangerous men and damsels in distress, living in a world far different from this one. You have there a meta moment. You have there one of the characters explaining another of the characters to the main character. The tertiary character explaining the secondary character to the main character says he was partial to fanciful stories. To our main character, this is a fanciful story. This is sort of the same suggestion as before. I felt I was becoming part of the story, but to an extent, it's a little bit deeper than that, because what it suggests is that, not directly, but it suggests Bowditch has some hand in the creation of the story that we're getting. Have you not noticed? Everyone that we meet here, Mr. Bowditch has gifted them something. We had the gifts for Dora. We had the gifts for Woody here. I believe there was something for Leia. I believe there was something for Leia. Then we have the signs out front. Bowditch came to this world and provided the very guideposts for all of the characters that we experience traveling. We don't experience Leia traveling. We don't experience Woody traveling. We don't experience Dora traveling. The people who are traveling are the people looking for Dora and her brother who use Mr. Bowditch's sign. The travelers we have are Charlie and Radar, who are using the signposts, Mr. Bowditch's initials, that he's left along the way. Mr. Bowditch had an outsized role in this world for his presence. Have you or have you not heard of someone authoring something as it does not pertain to literature? You often hear, for example, in sports, Dan Marino authored a storied career, right? He was a great quarterback who did great things, but ultimately it was a disappointment because he never got a Super Bowl, but he authored that career. Mr. Bowditch is authoring his existence in Impus. It is interesting to see along the way. So the last two lit crit ideas that are worth mentioning here. All of these individuals that we see along the way, along the travels, not the stops, not Woody, not Leia, not Dora, the individuals we meet along the way, do they or do they not strike you much in the same way that the passers-by in the road struck you? Maybe you see someone else, maybe they seem like a living person, but there's automatically a guarded stance. There's automatically the assumption that this other person wants what you've got. Because we are in something that is not quite as post-apocalyptic as The Road, but we're not talking about the good times either. And also the gray, right? Everything in The Road is gray. And it makes you wonder if we get a lot of references here from Stephen King. We get a lot of pointing at Game of Thrones. We get a lot of pointing at mainly TV shows and movies. But the real influences on the writer don't need to be explicated, don't need to be handed to us. They come through in the text. If you're writing this wandering type of post-apocalyptic travel, how could you not channel The Road? And here's one thing I promise you. Stephen King has read it. Stephen King has read everything under the sun. If you read Danse Macabre, you understand that he's seen everything. He pretty much remembers everything, and he's read everything. So it is interesting to me to pick up something like that, which is possibly a reference, not necessarily a reference, not necessarily an homage, but maybe just an influence, further than the Easter eggs to other King works or the outright references that he gives us. Something like that, which is very, we've already used the word once, nuanced. Something which is very subtle, something which is not necessarily over the top or aggressive, something which is just in the text. And finally, Charlie. Charlie has these character moments which are mirroring themselves. We get Charlie the Savior, right? Charlie saves Bowditch. Charlie saves, to some extent, to some great extent, to an extent that I don't think the character has claimed credit for yet, saved his father. Charlie is now on his mission saving Radar. Okay, those are pretty easy to see, because this seems to be a core tenet of the Charlie character. One of the things which is not quite so easy to see yet is Charlie's penchant for creating his own enemies. Christopher Pauli sought Charlie out. Fine. Charlie stumbled across the dwarf fella. Okay, different happenings about. But they were concluded in much the same way. Charlie showed them up, damaged them. In the case of Christopher Pauli, broke his wrists. In the case of the dwarf fella, broke his pride. And then sends them on their merry way. They will be waiting for him. He has manufactured, has Charlie, his own enemies. Just an interesting thing to take up. He's manufactured these enemies by being merciful to an extent, right? Should have he killed Christopher Pauli? He had the perfect way to dispose of his body. Yeah, it would have been real easy. You don't think giant cockroaches are going to get rid of that body for you? Sure will. When no one else knows about that other world in the first place? Yeah, it would have been very easy. Instead, just broke his wrist and sent him on his way. What was the proper measure to take with this dwarf fella? Should he have just let him be? After all, it's just an insect. Doesn't have any real sense of pain, does it? Already maimed the insect. Now, if the dwarf fellow was going to kill the cricket, that probably would have been an easier death than whatever a maimed cricket is going to find out in the woods. Instead, he picked that fight. He showed the guy up, a guy who obviously has a bit of an ego on him, and made him go on his way. There's going to be something there. Also, this just struck me. He must have royal blood, right? Because Charlie mentioned that he was not gray, I think. So he must have royal blood. That is all of the lit crit observations I have. Now let's move on to the writer's circle stuff. And the first one that I want to bring up is something that I think it's something, if you're going to use it, you have to do it well. I don't think it's done well here. What are we doing here? Okay, doesn't matter. Look, be decisive with your language. I was reaching for the knocker when the door opened. Standing there was a man almost as tall as I was, but much thinner, almost gaunt. What does almost do for us there? Almost gaunt. Was he gaunt or not? Is there any reason to tell us he was almost anything? Is there any reason to tell us that he was almost anything? Maybe, but I can't think of a reason. I can't think of anything that you would describe someone as almost and it be important. He was almost thin. He was regular weight, right? When using these non-descriptive, descriptive words, you are completely negating all of the work that you've done. Moving on, 271. Oh, this is not, so there's a few things that absolutely rile me up. The almost stuff. You're not describing anything if you're saying something was almost something. Okay, why use the almost? Second, I don't like adverbs. I just don't. Third, and I can get into that at some point. Where are we at here? Yeah. I listen carefully, as if my life depended on it. First off, it does. Literally, it does. Your life depends on it. Not literally, because we're talking about a fictional character, but literally in the story, your life does depend on it. As if your life depended on it? What are you doing with that? Second off, it's a cliche. Cliches are terrible. This is, look, oh, it's bugging me. Okay. That's fine. Now it's totally crooked. I should have done this before I started recording at all. Doesn't matter. For the second time. This is awful. Cliches rob your character of a chance to use their authentic voice, as if my life depended on it. Because without listen, so I listened to him, I listened carefully, as if my life depended on it. Versus, I listened carefully, scared of what the giant bats would do to me. I listened carefully, only being fearful of what it was those night soldiers really looked like. Terrified of the thought what those night soldiers would do to a guy like me, etc., etc., right? There are so many different ways that you can express this without using a cliche. Now, on the overall, that same paragraph here, I think it's necessary to compliment Stephen King here while expressing something that is... Look, you want to tell the story in the story, right? You want to show us what's going on. But, very well, I understand, love. Here's what you must do. Listen carefully. Another day's walk until you will take you to the house of my cousin Claudia. If you move briskly enough, that is. When you get there, I listen carefully, as if my life depended on it, the wolves howling outside suggesting strongly that it did. You didn't show us Woody explaining to Charlie what he was going to have to do. And the reason you didn't do that is because it sets up giving us the story and then giving it to us again. If we sit there with Woody telling Charlie all of the things he has to do, and then we get all of the things he has to do, we're sitting through it twice, which sucks as a reader. The way this cutscene happened was heavy-handed, was clunky, but it saves the reader a whole lot of work. It saves the reader, and this is another thing that we get from Vonnegut, you should have pity on your reader. So this cutscene is awkward, is clunky, is unfortunate, but it's better writing than if it had not been utilized. And that is something that when we get to in stories is often, as a writer, it's a difficult choice to make. Stephen King undoubtedly wrote this knowing, God, this sucks to do. I have a cut scene here have a 10 minutes later at the bottom of the screen. You know, that's ugly type of writing. But it's way better than the alternative. And the last thing that I have here, the last note that I have here on a writer's level, something that's funny, and it's something that it's one of these I don't know what you don't know moments, right? Stephen King forgets, I think, here, as all writers do in moments like this. I'm not writing this off as Stephen King being a bad writer. I feel so terrible levying these discussions against Stephen King because he sold how many books now, right? But I think this is something that needs to be expressed. This is when Woody is showing the painting of Leia and Leia's mom, showing a painting of them to Charlie. And Leia had a mouth to smile with, and yes, they both looked like royalty. I pointed to the girl. This Leia? Before? I asked. Yes. Woody put the picture back in its place, just as carefully. Did you catch it? Woody's blind, remember? They both looked like royalty. I pointed to the girl. Who is that doing any good? Pointing to the girl isn't doing Woody any good, and is not doing Charlie any good because Woody has no idea which one of those characters in the painting he's talking about. Who's he referencing? Is this the girl? Is this Leia? Oh, I don't know. Which one are you pointing to there, Charlie? The one on the left or the one on the right? I can't see anything. So it's one of those I don't know what you don't know moments where Stephen King forgets that he's told us, or maybe Woody's not actually blind. That's a possibility, I guess. This could be a slip up in Charlie's viewpoint as opposed to the writer's, but pointing doesn't do us or the characters any good. That is all I have for this, the 15th in a 34-ish part series, as we go chapter by chapter through Fairy Tale by Stephen King, and I hope to have you back next time for chapter 16.